Serenaville, a mid-sized city in the heart of a prosperous country, was once renowned for its affordability and the quality of life it offered its residents. Despite its relatively modest economic status, the city ensured that all basic needs, housing, healthcare, education, and public transport were accessible and affordable. The local government committed to social welfare, implemented policies that promoted low-cost housing, and subsidized essential services. Life in Serenaville was simple, but yet comfortable. A perfect blend of community living and individual well-being. Radio tipping point. Right to a roof. Sheltered dreams are made of these. Mike Boyle. And for some of you who perhaps caught last week's show, where I referred to January being Global Root Cause Month, that one of the subjects that I talked about was homelessness. And I mentioned within the show that homelessness is just a symptom. The real problem, in fact, we make this problem worse in that we keep putting Band-Aids on them, because this allows for us to avoid looking at the root cause. And in that show, I mentioned the reasons why people end up in this homeless state. And I've been thinking about this the entire week. This question of homelessness, or the inability to put a roof over your head. If we were to follow the SDGs, that would be SDG number 11, which states that everyone has that right. So now we're talking about housing as being a human right. And to show how far removed we are from what our so-called aspirations are, and where we find ourselves to be, that we've noticed that this problem keeps getting infinitely worse, and we're seeing the repercussions. We had an election at the end of 2023 in Holland, where Geert Wilders, who has been around for an eternity in Dutch politics, received the most votes. And in fact, Wilders was surprised himself. He did not plan to have a big celebration. He booked a couple tables at a cafe and considered that was going to be it. And now he has become kingmaker. Now we know the subject of immigration. We know this too well. Another symptom. But like all populists, Wilders decided to play the housing card, because this has become a serious issue in Holland. Not talking about any type of real solutions, but of course we know this game too. And so we see what kind of influence this subject is playing out within our safe European homes and far beyond. And so I thought I would take a stab at coming up with a description of 3 different locations in different different continents and talk about the similarities and the differences to be found. The cities I've picked out are Lisbon, Toronto, and Auckland. And I'd heard that Toronto was a problem. I've seen Lisbon. I've seen that problem. And Auckland was a bit of a surprise. But actually, after you start looking at the information, it's not a surprise. It's not a surprise. There are some countries that are trying to make a sincere effort to address these problems, and we'll talk about that at the close, and describe that the best of intentions can actually boomerang. So consider this journey today, the journey that we'll be taking together, as being one of food for thought. Naomi Klein, in her book Disaster Capitalism, talks about this issue, concentrating on different disasters that took place, primarily in the United States, but not exclusively. The ones that come to mind are the ones in the U.S., one being the remnants of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans and the famous 9th District, which was the poorer area in town. Where the housing was neglected for a very long time, that once the levee broke, it took the 9th District pretty much with it. But because the neighborhood had been neglected, we were actually talking about older homes in a style that seems to be lost. Well, for those people with money, we have a soft spot for these types of neighborhoods, for these types of housing, for a world that probably never really existed, except in our minds. And we wanted to turn that dream into a reality. So, of course, what happens for all those individuals that were forced to flee New Orleans after Katrina and ended up anywhere? Well, the vultures came in and decided, well, here's our opportunity to capitalize on the misfortune of others. And so these individuals who had no money to begin with were forced to leave their domicile. Their houses were condemned, and then they were purchased by others for a song with the intention of either gentrifying the buildings or ripping them down completely and building something completely different. So Naomi Klein talks about this in detail and describes the problems that are associated with this type of approach. And I remember one story that she talked about tied to Houston, where individuals had to leave. They didn't have much money to begin with, which meant that they could never afford to live in the same neighborhood they left. But it gets much worse. That's where they grew up. That's their community. Which meant that they can't afford to live there anymore. They have to go somewhere else. To an area where they don't know anybody, where they have no ability to rely on social capital, that type of initiative that we find among people within a community that understand that the community is only as strong as the group and especially those that are being afflicted by whatever whatever problems they might have. As word of Serenaville's affordable living and high quality of life spread, it began to attract people from across the country. Gradually, it became a magnet of those seeking a better life and investors and developers looking to capitalize on the city's growing popularity. The influx of new residents and capital led to a rapid transformation. Businesses flourished. Cultural and recreational facilities multiplied, and the city's infrastructure expanded. So let's start with the first city on my list. That would be Lisbon. And in fact, this is another element that you find quite often, especially when we are trying to create a world that perhaps never really existed. But the city is an entertainment value for tourists, for meetings and congresses. That Lisbon is the newest member of the Magic Kingdom. That's right. Lisbon is our new Disneyland, and we know Disneylands, right? Venice is a Disneyland, Dubrovnik's a Disneyland, Salzburg probably falls in that line, and some people would find Vienna to be Disneyland, but of course we know that one. That's far from reality, right? But Lisbon has gone through one huge transformation, and that was something I wasn't aware of. And it's like one of those things, once you're aware of what the problem is, then you can't stop from seeing it all over. But let's go back to 1974 with Lisbon, or Portugal to begin with. That was the Carnation Revolution, where there was an army coup, a leftist coup, which sent Portugal in the direction where they are today, and that is meant in a positive way. The first problem they had is one of the few countries still in Europe that had colonies in Africa. You had Mozambique, you had Angola, Guinea-Bissau, and there was a strong Portuguese population in all of those countries. And because none of this was really planned, or perhaps it was planned, but not necessarily put into a project plan. It was a tipping point. Just like with Algeria and the French, you had the exodus of the Portuguese that were living in these former colonies, all coming back to Mother Portugal. So that obviously made the housing situation in Portugal quite tight at the time. And if we look at the population of the metropolitan Lisbon area, grow from 2 million back in 1974 to 3 million today. So an increase of about a third. So you have one of the poorer countries in Europe, but the cost of living was good. The weather was excellent. And if you surf, great place to spend holidays, or perhaps you might even decide that this is where I want to live. And we know how this story goes, right? Our good friends at Airbnb, within 1 year, and this year would be 2022, went from 8,000 properties to 14,000 properties in Lisbon. So let's walk through the scenario. once an apartment has been earmarked to go to Airbnb land, what do you think the chances are of anybody being able to properly rent that accommodation? So you have a country where the vast majority earn less than 1,000 euros a month. You have the Airbnb vultures coming through. You have the problem of gentrification. And then you have the onslaught tied to a simple procedure or legislation that was set through in 2012, which is very often called the Portuguese Golden Visa Program, or the official name is the Residence Permit for Investment Activity, which basically entices individuals to either invest a certain amount of money in Portugal, buy property, or start a business within Portugal. And they were given all kinds of goodies. So the first goodie is that they receive a visa to live and work and study in Portugal. They need to spend a certain amount of days in Portugal every year, but that was minimal. They had the possibility of bringing their entire family into Portugal. And within 5 years, they would receive permanent residency. And then within 6 years, they would have the possibility of obtaining the Portuguese citizenship. And lastly, they were allowed access to the entire Schengen area. So you could imagine for individuals that had enough cash and they were looking for either a plan B or possibly even a plan A, that such an offer cannot be beat, or it's difficult to be beat. So this has caused all kinds of chaos for those individuals that grew up in a neighborhood that's really all they knew. And then all of a sudden, whoosh, 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 you have the Airbnb vultures hovering over your neighborhood and just waiting for that opportunity to pounce on those properties. And you can imagine, let's say that it's an older neighborhood where perhaps the buildings are somewhat dilapidated. The individuals living there has probably been handed, it's a hand-me-down from generations. These people living there don't have much income to begin with. Then you have these visitors from overseas We're offering a lot of money. A lot of money. And let's assume that you've had some bad luck. It's no coincidence that this golden visa plan was deployed in 2012. It was one of the remnants of the financial crisis. We forget that Portugal was on the naughty list, like Ireland and Greece. Spain almost ended up there. So they were in austerity mode. And when things get so desperate, you feel that you have no choice to sell what you have. And that accommodation that had been passed on from generation to generation, well, that's basically the family silver, isn't it? That's the family silver. And so the situation in Lisbon has reached a climax. That condition is no longer a Portuguese secret. The word has gotten out. An interesting statistic that I ran across in preparation for the show. The average age of children moving out of the home of their parents. In Portugal, it's almost 34 years. 33.6 years is the average, which is the oldest in Europe. And we know that there are some other countries that come pretty close. And I suspect that once those 34-year-olds move out, that either they move out of Portugal for good, and we know about the Portuguese diaspora long before 1974, where 10% of the population in France was of Portuguese extraction. And then I raised the question, so apart from us being far removed of looking at housing as being a human right, what can the overall quality of life be? And you see the repercussions and you see the backlash, and it's coming. As I mentioned in the beginning of the show, the reaction of the Dutch populace to a rapidly deteriorating situation tied to housing in a country that had prided itself on having social housing, not just in Amsterdam, but throughout the entire country. That it would cause such a reaction. But I had forgotten what was taking place in the next country that I wanted to cover, that being Canada, looking specifically at Toronto. That the time prior to the handover of Hong Kong from the United Kingdom to the People's Republic of China, there was a mad dash to get out of town for the Hong Kong Chinese, for a number of them, those that couldn't afford it. And I remember the price tag back then was about 500,000 Canadian dollars, something along those lines. That if you were able to invest that money, then that was their version of the Golden Visa program. And because I started with one benchmark, starting the comparison in 74, I continued on that route looking at Toronto. So at the time, Toronto had a population of close to 2,400,000. And this would be metropolitan Toronto. And today, it has a population of almost 6,400,000. That is an increase of almost 300%, actually more like 270%. And we see a similarity here. It's a little bit difficult to come up with stats specifically for Toronto, but I was able to come up with some information pertaining to Canada as a whole. And that 1/3 of all young adults, those being between 20 and 34, are living with their parents. Obviously, Canada has a different starting point in comparison to Portugal. Relatively well-off country. But we see the same problems there as we saw here being Lisbon in this particular case, with speculation, with the gentrification, with the influx of people from all over. And any time you have such a strong influx, that means that you're going to have some sort of exodus. And the stat I was able to come with, the most recent statistic, was in 2022, that we had an outflow from Toronto of close to 80,000 people. But of course, in comparison to the inflow, that's like a spit in the ocean. And it wasn't always this way. That in the mid-70s, there was a strong emphasis on building accommodation, primarily tied to single-family homes, which meant that we fostered the expansion not to the sky, but to cover a stronger land mass. And we know the problems that are tied to that type of expansion. And that means that there is no comparable public transportation to cover all of this growth that's taking place, which means that the individuals are compelled to rely upon that of what they have, and that would be the automobile. And to be fair, there was a bit of a mix at that time in Toronto, that you would have the single-family homes, and then you would have townhouses or condos, and some apartment buildings. And there was rent control at the time in the province of Ontario, because they knew that they saw the lessons of their southern neighbor, and realized if they were not taking these types of measures, then they were going to have all kinds of serious problems. And because it's always a question of supply and demand, there was enough demand to meet all kinds of needs. And with that, the situation remained tenable in Toronto. But if we look at the situation today, unfortunately, it's anything but. So within an increase of 270% of population, then all these people need a place to live. So that means that the demand is huge. It was huge. And unfortunately, in comparison to those initiatives that were found within the 1970s, there was a dearth of supply because the momentum was lost to keep these things in check. So they turned around, and all of a sudden, this problem was completely out of control. And as we know how all of this works within supply and demand, then the supply goes to the highest bidder. And that puts pressure on the costs within the neighborhood. So let's assume you're a renter and you were paying a certain amount of money per month. And we shouldn't forget that this housing is a big business. That's the reason why we do it. It's not a human right. We're talking about making money. So all of a sudden, the rent control has been relaxed within those trends that we've seen over the last 40 years, and believing that the market is the savior. The market has a way of making sure that we have everything covered. So we left it to the market. And the market said to these people who were living in these neighborhoods for years, they've been living there for years, that as of tomorrow, we're going to have to jack your rent 50%. So we both know that those individuals did not get a 50% pay raise. So that left them in a bit of a dilemma, right? So they either make more of a sacrifice to stay where they've been for such a long time, or they better come up with a plan B very, very soon. And after a while, you get tired. You get tired of the fight. You get tired of the injustice. You get tired of being tired. And then you get to the point of saying, you know what? I'm out of here. I'm out of here. So this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, doesn't it? Because the people who can't afford to live in the neighborhood end up moving out. They were gently forced out. And that means that only people who have money are able to live in these neighborhoods. So what kind of community do we have in these neighborhoods after those people who had been living there for years on end cannot afford to live in that neighborhood anymore? Well, then we're back to what Maggie Thatcher said was, well, we don't have a society. We have individuals and we have families. But in this particular case, we don't even have families because families can't afford to live in these neighborhoods. So we just have a collection of individuals. Who were very happy because they had enough money to be autonomous units that had no relation to what took place before they actually moved in. They have no relation to those individuals who they're living next to. And what takes place afterwards? Well, I got my stuff covered, so good luck to you. That's pretty much the thought. Now, in all fairness, there are some efforts being made. In Lisbon, they're seriously looking at this golden visa program, and I think they're in the process of drastically curtailing some of the benefits that have been offered over the years. But in Toronto, they are coming to the conclusion that maybe the free market, if we leave all this to the free market, that the free market actually leads us to the situation. And so we are no longer talking about a human right for housing. So there are some efforts in looking at the housing policy. There are enough individuals who feel empowered, who are saying they're as mad as hell and they're not going to take it anymore. So we have a fair amount of community activism taking place. And there are all kinds of initiatives that are to be found in Toronto or in the outskirts, where we are able to come up with alternate forms of housing. For example, co-housing, one being an option, where we have our apartments, but we also have a common area. And for us here in Vienna, if we're knowing the history of the Gemeindebauten, we know that this is nothing new. That was the whole idea, right? That you would have the kindergarten located on the premises. You would have the place to wash the clothes. Also in the premises there was a community rooms. So let's go back to Serenaville. So the consequence, the deterioration of Serenaville, the very essence of what made Serenaville an affordable haven had become to erode. The cost of housing skyrocketed, and the lower and middle income families, once the backbone of the city, found themselves priced out of their own community. Homelessness began to surface as a serious issue. Economic disparities widened, and the social fabric that once held the community together started to fray. The city, once a model of inclusive and affordable living, had become a victim of its success, characterized by gentrification and social inequality. Radio Tipping Point. Our show today is titled Right to a Roof. Sheltered dreams are made of these. My name is Mike Boyle. So we've looked at Lisbon. We've taken a peek at Toronto. The last stop would be Auckland. Auckland, New Zealand. And I was a little bit surprised that Auckland had also been characterized as having such a serious problem, but when you think about it, it all makes perfect sense. You have a country of, I'm not exactly sure what the population is today, but I remember it being something along the lines of 3 million people, very small, where the vast majority were living in the bigger cities. And looking specifically in the case of Auckland, the population in 1974 was 710,000, and today it's at 1,478,000. Let's say 1.5. So I'm going to take a guess the population of New Zealand is no longer at 3. It's definitely gone up. It's probably closer to 5. And that means that most people are living in cities, either in Auckland or Christchurch. And New Zealand's one of those countries that has gone through similar turbulence we could find in Canada. There's been a tremendous influx coming from outside New Zealand, and they're not all Australians either. But looking at the stats of last year, they had a net inflow of 141,000 and 33,000 left Auckland to try their luck somewhere else. Most likely a situation not too dissimilar to that of what I described for Toronto, where you cannot afford to live in the community where you grew up. And you decide, if I'm going to make something of myself, it's not going to be here. But that means if we have a net of 141,000, we had really an inflow of 170,000 coming into Auckland. And we see the same issues as we saw with Toronto and certainly with Lisbon, with this whole idea of supply and demand and the speculation. And the foreign investment and the lack of social housing. But Auckland has an additional constraint. Well, you could theoretically say that Lisbon has somewhat of this constraint as well, but not nearly as pronounced. New Zealand is an island, which means that there's only so far you can take the development. You've got to reach a point where you've hit the Pacific Ocean. So there's a clear geographical constraint. And so, with that, Auckland is seen as having one of the least affordable housing markets in the entire world. So we've talked about in what dire straits we are. And perhaps the locals here in Vienna should be truly appreciative of our situation. So what measures do we have at our disposal to manage this? Certainly changing our overall housing policy, which could be tied to zoning laws. In other words, areas that were perhaps off base for housing development would be opened. The legislation to ensure that the situation remains equitable. And as we saw in the example of Toronto, that in the 70s they had a mix of different types of accommodation. Meaning you had your single family homes, you had your condominiums, and then you had the apartments. And so it's important to have a mix. And one of the key elements that we take for granted here in Vienna, and coming from an area where it was anything but, the idea of social housing, that it's open for everybody, and very often we will think that is unfair, that you have people that can clearly afford something else, that they would be taking advantage of the situation. And I can understand that feeling. I could understand it. But we shouldn't forget that anything that we can do to ensure that you have people with different financial wherewithal living together allows for a community to be set up. And let's go through some of the points that I think are very important to consider here. It's one of those things that I always think about when taking public transportation here, that very often it's the only opportunity that I have to meet certain people in this society that do not live in my neighborhood. And to remind ourselves that there are others who are living here that I don't know about. I don't see them. So if we have a mix of people coming from different social strata living together, then they might not necessarily be your best friends, but you know who they are. They are no longer the boogeymen. And you might even develop some sort of affinity. But we don't have this massive massive upheaval that I've described from Lisbon and Toronto and from Auckland, and there are a number of cities that I could have described today in this program, where communities were being ripped apart due to speculation, due to the lack of a coherent housing policy to be found in whatever the jurisdiction may be. Where people had the right to stay where they were, and that allows for a certain amount of stability, that allows for a coherence in our society that should not be discounted. So once you have people living longer in an area, that the chances of them actually establishing a real community are much higher. And you can ensure that the development taking place in your city is sustainable, that you do not have these wild swings that there's a certain amount of consistency to be found. And of course, those other things that we need along with the housing, that would be providing for mobility, specifically public transportation. But that's too big of a kettle of fish to cover specifically today. I still wanted to cover one example that came out quite often in looking to see, is there a shining light out there? And it's not just with education, but it seems like the Finns have done a rather passable job when it comes to addressing this question of homelessness. And I hope you're all sitting down. This is going to be the shock of our lives here to understand that the Finns have decided that the best way of solving homelessness is not to put another Band-Aid on it with another homeless shelter, which means that you remain temporary wherever you are, and it doesn't address the root cause. But they have decided, and the program is called Housing First, that they first ensure that the individuals have a place to live, which means that level 2 Maslow of the question of security, where they don't have to think, so where am I going to spend the night tonight, has been taken away. Now, of course, that's just the beginning on a longer journey to find out, so what's the reason of the homelessness? And we know that list can be very long. And the addiction is another symptom, but that means we take the time to look at the root cause. And that means that we do not push the most important component of this all to the side. We remind ourselves that we're talking about human beings. We're talking about human beings that have needs. We're talking about human beings just like you and me. And that's it. They're just like you and me. Maybe the difference is that we were a little bit luckier. Maybe the difference is that we were able to start on day one having that security and that safety and that stability. We had it all. So we never had to think about it. And for those who were not so fortunate, for those who are probably convinced throughout the years that they are no longer worthy of stability, no longer worthy of security, no longer worthy of contentment. That's really where we need to start the discussions. And one thing we should remind ourselves constantly as much as we fool ourselves, that could have been us. It only takes one bad accident It only takes one financial crash. It only takes one natural calamity. It only takes neglecting our democratic duties and our democratic rights that could lead us to that situation. So think about that the next time you see somebody who is in dire straits, that doesn't have a place to live, and remind yourself that could have been you. That could have been you. So that's some food for thought for this cold day in January. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for allowing me to indulge and pass on thoughts that are very important to me. And I hope you find the ability, in whatever form that may be, to look at the root causes that you might run across with the intention together of making 2024 something that we can all celebrate. Thank you.